right. Perfect. Hey, so good morning and welcome. Apologies, I actually stopped the screen share for a second there. Anyway, so welcome to DevSecOps and Application Modernization. So we're going to talk about a number of different things, and really the key across almost all of this is this focus of DevSecOps in our organizations and how that evolution is actually impacted by the changes over the last 10 years in DevOps, and really where that fits in terms of individual roles and responsibilities, as well as some of the things that, you know, in industry through this constant evolution and what we see in terms of changes across organizations related to DevSecOps. So we'll send out the deck to everyone after we're done. But let's get started. So welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming from and where you're at. Feel free to throw questions in if you have any. Otherwise, we'll just rock through this presentation. So first of all, I'm George Neese. So I work for WebAge in digital transformation across a number of different areas, including DevSecOps as an evolution of a combination of information security and DevOps, cloud native application modernization, and a few other things. So if you're a LinkedIn person, feel free to reach out. If not, don't worry, you're not required to be a LinkedIn person to be part of the DevSecOps community or DevOps for your organization. So across this is really the workshop or session or webinar, really the evolution of DevSecOps, this idea of, you know, computer security, the all brains in the game. We'll talk through CIA, user security, and then we'll finish up with a number of areas from the OWASP top 10. So DevOps itself, you know, is really almost, you know, 10 years old for most organizations at this point in terms of not necessarily their implementation, but really, you know, where we start. So if you think about it, everybody's been doing development and operations that's had any software engineering or software development lifecycle within their organization. So DevOps is a discipline that's constantly evolving, and of course the evolution here is really from DevOps to DevSecOps and the security of our software that we're not only developing, but then delivering and across all of the enterprise. So that includes our partners, our vendors, of course, the users. And if you think about it, a lot of this is the constant change, the recognition that there is an evolving need, the notion that things that worked in the past are most likely not something that we look at now. A great example of that is really this notion of password rotation. I mean, people have been doing forced password rotations for years and years, and what that results in is people coming up with ways to game our password policies so that they can use the same, you know, password or password style over a long period of time. And so the move from single factor to multi-factor authentication is a really great notion of evolution, because similarly as well, if you're going to have multi-factor and you're going to start doing these things, how is it that we're actually going to recognize the risks in moving from one pattern to another, and then giving people that gold master that allows them to understand, you know, what that really means in terms of the expectation for security. And if you think about it, most organizations have focus individually or across groups, lines of business, segment. And so everybody has different policies, different rules. You know, it's difficult to understand what the holistic enterprise strategy for an organization is. So where do you actually begin with this? So, I mean, the implementation of that improved security is really about understanding where you are now. So DevSecOps, just like DevOps, is a strategy. So that means I have to know what is the state of security in the application in the organization now. And there's lots of great examples of organizations that we see who make the front page of the Wall Street Journal and honestly don't know what their security risks are. don't know that they're exposing significant amounts of their data, don't realize that they've allowed people to become complacent or to use policies that really don't effectively guard our data and our systems. So planning across all of this. So once you know where you're at, in terms of everything from what platforms you use, the languages, the password policies, how many different paths through this are there? What are your partners doing? How do you vet your third-party application services or APIs that you're using? How do you actually give them the right questions to recognize that their use of technology is aligned with what your security, Secure-SDLC and DevOps and DevSecOps policies are? So all of this is then that prioritized movement. So a lot of times when we think about this, security itself is a fairly large mountain in almost every major enterprise organization, especially organizations that have been around for quite some time. The key with that really is that if you look at the mountain, it's really hard to recognize that you need to just action this in terms of individual rocks. What is it that we can ensure that people understand? And then finally, if we really have DevSecOps or information security or whatever our keyword is for this, because really this is spreading security across the organization and recognizing that that's an everyone thing, not an I, not a you, not the information security team, not the CISO or the CSIM or some specific portion of the organization or a set of leaders. This is really getting everyone involved. And then, of course, if we're going to do that and we're going to make a change in the organization, then eventually we have to anchor it, which means that, surprisingly enough, if security is one of the key components of our information technology or overall in terms of a business strategy for our organization, especially if we're actually selling software, then that means we have to anchor that in people's talent. So here's, you start out always on a journey, and then where you are in terms of that journey is important too. So someone who's starting a journey into an organization that just hasn't been traditionally focused on security other than just locking down servers, doing SOX compliance, some of the things that we see in different areas around GDPR, it really depends on what is the state of where you are now, so understanding. So seeking to understand before being understood, right? So then we're going to get into some security fundamentals across this, because the thing with this is that all of this includes a lot of blocking and tackling. If you walk into your network operations center or your cloud operations center or whatever you have in terms of centralized resource management for your applications, your systems, your flow of data, you'll quickly realize that there's always a screen somewhere in that room that shows all of the people trying to penetrate your network, all of the people trying to basically hack their way in. So whenever you get started, it's not a bad idea to start out with something that, to be honest, is at least a little tongue-in-cheek. So if you give me lots of money, I will do various vague things to increase your web security. Our web security expert here says, of course, the boss says, wow, I would have been happy with just vague things, various things, but that vague stuff sounds great too. And now, of course, Dilbert is now responsible for this, and don't screw up his vagueness plan. And so security regularly becomes a really vague area for most of the people who are not directly related to information security or InfoSec or DevSecOps within the organization. So we have to recognize is that if it's vague, it's not clear, and clarity is absolutely required for security. It doesn't mean to publish your password rotation rules, lists of your key users, any of these things around using third-party software where you leave default settings for ports and passwords and users. All of these things are incredibly vague. We want to be very clear, but we also need to be very concise. So the thing with this in terms of blocking and tackling is if I give someone a list of 100 things that they need to do, and I don't tell them that the first 5 are the only ones I really care about in the beginning, in the first month, in the first year, then there's no way for them to digest that. It's the same thing if I had a performance plan or individual development plan, or my key metrics, or my business scorecard for myself, my group, my business, my line of business, my portion of the organization was 100 elements, there's no way that I can satisfy those, because that is way too complicated for almost any human being to be able to digest and then act on. So then we talk about this in terms of, protecting our computing systems and data. So computer and information security, and by example, DevSecOps, is really the protection of these systems and the data that they store or access. And that is changing significantly over the time that, not necessarily in the time that we're going to sit on this session over the last, handful of minutes. And again, like I mentioned, I'll be sending this deck out. Well, I probably won't be sending it, but somebody will be sending it. So you will most likely not be getting an email from George Neese, but keep in mind that, that you will be getting this deck should you have that interest, of course. And then, feel free to share it. I mean, this is part of a larger, DevSecOps offering that we do at WebAge, which is essentially everything from introduction across the organization to specifics around, CI/CD, cloud adoption. All of these different areas have their own specific security aspects. And when you think about this, so what is this computer and information security in a world where we're doing something like DevOps, or we're doing autonomous teams? Does that mean that if I'm doing self-organizing or autonomous teams, that I should allow everybody to decide what their own security strategy is? That would be a hopeless mess within a short period of time, and so we'll walk through some of that. So why is security important? Well, no surprise, because most of us don't want our organization to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Or as we saw with Cathay Pacific on the front of CNN and every major news organization, because no surprise, once you make the mistake, you're into the spotlight, and all of this is actually not only not allowing people to carry out their mission, it's a significant distraction from the day-to-day. So security should not be something that is part of unplanned work. Security should be planned work. It should be allowing us to do our jobs and carry out business and actually support, business processes. The issue, of course, with a lot of people in terms of the ivory tower security is that it becomes really an anchor on your ability to deliver business value, delivering time to market, the notion of protecting things to the point where no one can get their job done. Not what we're talking about. We're talking about putting in automation in place so that we can do risk and threat and vector assessments against an evolving set of attacks and even standards, as well as the data that we're using and the evolution of the applications. Because no surprise, almost all organizations are undergoing right now, and have been over time, things like DevOps, things like cloud native application modernization. If an organization is actually going to take 300, 400, 500 of their applications out of, or a percentage, say we take 10% of our applications, we put them all into hybrid, public or private cloud, from wherever they were today, moving brownfield or creating greenfield, all of that is an incredible amount of change. And so the volume of change that we have actually affects the amount and the impact that we have from security. So we want to allow people to get this change and to move this forward, but we really have to give people clarity. People aren't really afraid of change as much as they are afraid of not knowing how to do their job in a world of constantly evolving tools, technology, process, capabilities, skills, and roles. So all brains in the game. So if you're familiar with Jack Welch, arguably one of the most famous CEOs of this century anyway, globally and for sure in the United States. So security is everyone's responsibility, and this all brains in the game means people understand through standards, through passwords, through everything that actually allows us to remove the idea of social engineering. And so I was at a very large enterprise organization earlier this week, walking through their cybersecurity offerings, and actually someone who sells to organizations cybersecurity, and And when we start looking through some of the numbers, the key here is to help people to protect themselves. A common metric that you see, and whether you range it from 10 to 25%, roughly the number I see is about 12% of all people who get a insecure email or an attachment will actually click on it. They will actually open things that we're regularly trained not to do because they believe that it's something that that is relevant or is part of their day-to-day, or they're busy, or they're just not thinking. So we want to make sure that we make it easy for people to learn this notion of agile security, tied back to agile architecture, tied back to agile vendor management. All of this means that as we evolve the organization, we have to have ways to have feedback loops. And if we think about this from the DevOps handbook, right, the notion there, and if you haven't read the DevOps handbook, of course, pretty clear recommendation for reading the Phoenix Project as well, the State of DevOps from Puppet, a number of other things that we'll provide in terms of reading material that we recommend in the courses that we actually deliver, the webinars and even the coaching when we start talking about that. So when you think about it, what is it there that's their foundations for those guys who wrote the DevOps handbook is flow, feedback, and continuous learning. Well, all of this is about giving people the understanding of, the reason that we have passwords is to keep systems secure. So when we start to put, hard and fast rules on the way that we do password rotations, and we do that regularly across many different systems, it ends up being people basically reusing the same passwords over and over and over. Now, they may change them, but they're changing them in such an insignificant way that that really isn't helpful. So we need to make sure that we're recognizing and looking. And the only way to do that really is when we start talking about something that's pretty popular in the Scrum Agile methodology. So as a Scrum Master, regularly you're required to do mirroring. So if we think about this, how are you mirroring security to the people who are doing it? So does everyone understand that by taking their secure password and tacking an 01, 02, 03, and using that over the course of years to basically game the password rotation policy, that they're not actually helping the security of the organization? And those are actually not near as egregious as some of the things we've seen in organizations over the last 3 years. So keep in mind, this all brains in the game is focused as well on all of us individually as individual contributors or managers, but from a CIO and CTO and even CEO perspective for technical organizations, which most of us are, you have to realize that security, along with DevOps and cloud, are the three main technology initiatives in almost every organization, the three focus points for addressing technical debt. So see something, say something. So not only in the US, but in Canada, in various countries in Europe and APAC, we'll see people actually with this same notion that in the US we have as TSA. So our security for airlines, which is see something, say something. And see something, say something is almost never the way that it actually works in most organizations. If you think about it, we have this Equifax breach. So how many people recognized that there was this sensitive data exposure, this broken authorization around using admin as a user ID and a password? And regularly, and in not only yearly, but across different organizations, they publish the top 10 worst passwords that people are actually using. And if you think about that, of course, that's football, and not just American football, really the football that everyone else in the world recognizes. Baseball, monkey, password, admin, all passwords that people still regularly use because they want to remember their password. They don't have some easy way to actually create secure credentials. They're not getting inline recommendations. So if you're having a system that's actually letting people create passwords, by and large, the evolution would be recommend a password to them that's random, scrambled, and super secure. And then if they decide to change that to something that absolutely stinks, then at least you're trying. Now here, this is a little different because we're talking admin side. How many people at Equifax knew that that password on a database with millions of customer records with highly sensitive data was the same for both the username and password, but yet never said anything? And if you think about it too, the people at Equifax and leadership were called out because, no surprise, their chief information security officer was a music major who had been promoted through the organization and really didn't have credentials as a security person. And so all of that, shows an incredible lack of focus. Giving the person who draws the short straw the security leadership role is really not helpful. So lessons learned the hard way. So if you think about it, again, here we have this, we have a company that's well known and respected, at least within the US. They made some pretty clear mistakes in their move to Canada, if you're from that, part of the world. And of course, if you think about it, there's other examples of this across the universe. So storing the 3-digit codes on a credit card is been against PCI DSS rules, our payment card industry data security standards, for years. And how many hundred people knew, because this has been baked into development within systems, how many people knew that that was happening as developers, architects, administrators, testers across the organization? There must have literally been dozens, if not hundreds of people. And of course, that lesson learned the hard way, and the reason why security literally is a focus is not so much because people recognize it can cause permanent reputational damage and cost millions of dollars. It's because in a lot of these large organizations, the senior leaders have been fired. And so that's really part of the thing that's driving security in most organizations, is this desire to keep your job and not to have that significant reputational damage. And no surprise, when the CEO gets fired, that is an aha moment for everyone else, as happened at Target. And of course, similar at Equifax. And of course, we know that the leader of Facebook is still there, although to be honest, even he looked pretty foolish when he was testifying about some of the things he was doing, because essentially it showed that not only was he not genuine in his concerns about security, but that he was insincere in his ability to really come to open and articulate conversation. Even though the people who were asking him the questions from our American Congress were clearly not very versed on security, it would have been better if he had actually been very much more clear about what the implications were and really the whole focus of changing. So here we have a partner who's enabled, in this case, Cambridge Analytica, to put together something on a platform which allows them to steal a huge amount of the organization's data. And if you think about it, many organizations don't lose data from within in terms of their systems. They lose them through third parties, as we saw with GM, as we've seen with auto organizations in other parts of the world, and airlines and manufacturers. Third-party channel partners, vendors who are given privileged access into your systems without having vetting of their use of the data, with their cloud architecture, with their DevSecOps tooling. All of that opens up doors that we don't even know exist, and we have to be able to ask those questions. And then last, in terms of the recognition that you're living on the edge, is this Cathay Pacific. So Cathay Pacific they state 9 million records. Now the thing is the minute someone states 9 million, you know that that's a fraction of what it really is. Because all of these 4 data breaches, people come out and make statements, and then later they revise them to significantly increase the number of exposure that they have. In many cases, the organizations state what they believe this exposure is, and they haven't even actually closed all the doors or holes in their own organization to recognize that this is a living on the edge and not just an Aerosmith moment for people who recognize that, that lyric from an Aerosmith song. It's really about how is it we can actually see these things and take them to heart and not just try to essentially, do this CYA. So the CIA of data security is really the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability. So data and data exposure, sensitive data usage, audit trails, logging, monitoring, all of these are key areas of information security of DevSecOps. And when we think about this, this is changing in a world where we're talking about containerized microservices using languages that many people are not overly familiar with, like Go, or others like Rust, Kotlin, Amazon Web Services, Azure Functions, Google Cloud Functions, PCF, the Pivotal Cloud Foundry Functions. All of these things are technology changes that we have to, that impact data and actually have to use data and now have it flowing across an ever more componentized architecture, allowing more or increased threat vectors in terms of the opportunity for people to make mistakes. And so here we really have to bake security not into just the applications, but in our data handling, and really giving people the notion of not becoming the experts themselves, but relying on the overall organization and the understanding and really the push and pull of the evolution of security throughout the organization in the handling of not only data, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. So users and NAA, so non-repudiation, authentication, authorization. Can you, with a surety, identify every single person or process, service account that changes data, that modifies applications, and do you have a clear audit trail that then also includes automated threat analysis to do alerts and notifications? So all of this is really recognizing when someone's actually doing something. So it includes creating credentials and systems and data streams that are completely not real, that are areas where when someone touches them, you know that you have been penetrated, that you have been hacked. And is your first reaction when you have somebody break through an authorization or an authentication to just shut that account down? Well, of course not. The first reaction should be, how did these folks get here? How did this person, group, whoever it is that's where they're supposed to be, how did they get where they are, and why are they there, and what else are they touching? So we want to be able to see that, and the only way we can see that is if we have clear standards across the organization for log monitoring, across logging strategy, monitoring strategy, audit trailing, authentication, authorization. So security as a service. So no surprise, a different variety of SaaS. So you may be already aware of SaaS and IaaS and PaaS, the three NIST specific models that were output more than 10 years ago. And keep in mind that if the organization is still looking at cloud from a perspective of NIST from 10 years ago, they've got some major evolution and evolutionary needs. They're still looking at something that has evolved significantly in a period of time to be quite a bit different than it was. And so all of this means we have to have people that are forward looking. We have to have people in our own organization who are given that time. And so one of the questions that I always recommend people ask as they're doing these webinars is to go back and talk to your boss, and everyone has a boss. And of course, this is not just your boss at work. This is your boss at home if you have a president of home operations, or partnership if you have a partnership, or whatever that is. And it's the organizations around you. If you're part of a church group, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, your soccer team, anybody who has data, has applications, has things that move around, you want to say, hey, what is it that we have in place? And then more importantly for us when we're talking about work is, what is the expectation? So from your leader, how are they graded? How are you graded on security individually? What is it that's the time you're given to understand how secure the applications, the data, whatever your role is? And of course, this is specific, obviously, in terms of tools, technology, processes across individual roles. Somebody who's doing application development is probably got a slightly different roles and responsibilities than someone who's a database administrator, a data modeler, an architect, app dev manager, a quality, analyst, the CIO or CTO or CISO. So recognizing what those are. And so there's lots of vendors who are selling these SaaS solutions. And when we think about security as a service, if we're going to give somebody else responsibility for the security of our application through vaulting, through credentialing, through outside email, through, Azure Active Directory in cloud, federation of AD into AWS, all of these things mean that I have to have somebody who understands that at a triangle level. And so for me, this becomes a Kaizen skills map question. So across organizations, how do you find people who are key in terms of their knowledge and skills for security of data, security of databases, security of backing services? So all of this around things, who is the expert in security in Kafka if you use that, or IBM MQ or TIBCO, or NoSQL databases, the Mongos, the InfluxDBs, the relational, the Oracles, the Amazon, AWS RDSs, the IBM DB2s. Who are those experts? And so by having a way to actually map skills in our inventory, and this means that circles are going to be people who are starting out in a particular skill. Squares would be people who can work without supervision, without really support on things that don't require an expert. And then triangles are going to be our experts. So where are our experts in information security, in security across data, in DevSecOps around secure CI/CD pipelines? All of these things require us to understand. And no surprise, that extends out into this model of security as a service. Who are the experts for their organization? And how do you get to talk to them? Most enterprise organizations, and I would guess most of the folks on this session, work for very large companies. You buy software from significant numbers of vendors, most likely. How are they brought in to show what their strategy is and to show that they have concerns and that they have an evolution and an evolutionary mindset, that they recognize that information security is a constant paradigm shift? And so what does that actually mean when you think about it? Because paradigm shift, of course, across all of these things means lots of things to different people. When I hear that word paradigm, I usually think, well, that's a really big word that doesn't make sense to a lot of people. But to me, it just means thinking differently. Security in an age of cloud and DevOps, DevSecOps means thinking differently. So securing to the edge. So when we think about this from cloud, if we have IaaS, infrastructure as a service, we're responsible for securing the applications and the platforms we put on it. As we move from left to right here, from IaaS to SaaS, and here we're talking about software as a service, not security as a service, and recognize that all of these as a service, now almost everything is as a service. Pizza as a service, your Domino's, your coffee as a service through Tim Hortons or Starbucks or Caribou or, Coffee Day, depending on what part of the world you're in. And so if you think about it, what is it that our vendors are providing if I'm using SaaS? If I'm using a platform, how well do we understand the security implications and requirements and evolution of that? When we talk about this from a cloud perspective, think about it from a functions as a service. So FAS, otherwise known as serverless, event-driven, the AWS Lambda, Azure Functions, Pivotal Cloud Functions, Google Cloud Functions, OpenWhisk for IBM soft layer, all of these things are rapidly evolving. If Lambda itself was created only a handful of years ago, and the Google and Azure and PCF versions have only come out in the last months to 2 years, then how well have those folks secured what they have? Again, recognizing that this isn't all brains in the game and securing to the edge. So challenges for sure is about the notion of trying to do time to market, the variety of applications and data, the velocity of change that people are expecting through the use of Agile, the complexity as we move into containerized microservice applications built in scripting languages like Node, or using different front-end layers like React and Modernizer, using different backing services that people may or may not be as familiar with. And then, as much as anything in this, is this move to open source. So the move away from vendors who suffer reputational damage should their software be exposed, to open source software where really the reputational damage, if somebody uses Go and there's a defect, is not going to fall back on Google, who actually created Go per se, and still maintain that standard. It's going to fall directly on you as somebody who's using open source in an organization. And so how you become self-supporting and consider yourself to be a really top-notch tier 1 security provider internally when you're using all of these open solutions. So you are it. So security, funny enough, you are it. So if you think about it, this is not only the all brains in the game, but it's what is your role? What is the impact on me from security, and what's in it for me? Well, first of all, what's in it for me is if things are secure, I'm unlikely to have unplanned work based on exposure like all of the people at Cathay Pacific have going on right now. If you've ever been in a security breach, you recognize that in the old days, the idea was to keep things as quiet as possible. And hopefully now that's just slowly evolving in your organization or in any organization, which is a rapid recognition that where there's smoke, there's fire. And if you have an issue, then everyone needs to be recognizing it. And that creates an entire amount of churn. So the impact on organizations that have not actually kept their security up to snuff is that they generate a huge amount of unplanned work that takes away from business initiatives, that takes away from continuous improvement, that takes away from their CI/CD pipelines, that takes away from their time to market, and that just shows the mountain of technical debt that most organizations have incurred. And this gets even more impactful when you start thinking about extending to the physical devices. So if you're part of an IoT initiative, then you must recognize already that here, we're not only talking about the exposure of data within our own organization, we're talking about the exposure of data to any place where we have collectors. In smart cities, in smarter planet, in smart cars, and there's this endless volume of things that can create fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but really tag because you are it. So why is security so important? Because as I mentioned earlier when we started this out, and feel free to pump questions in, I believe everyone should be able to throw questions. As a guy who worked at Accenture for years and IBM, and many Fortune or Global 500 enterprises, I can basically talk your face off. But I'm happy to take questions, and we'll leave a number of minutes at the end to do so. So hackers are basically people who are using our computers to gain unauthorized access. And as I mentioned earlier, at this very moment, if you're in an organization that's more than 5,000 people, you can assume that you have 15 individuals, groups, mafia, countries trying to hack your systems. Now, depending on what you have as quality of data, from customer identifiables, social security, credit card, health data, that number could go up. If you have very, very uninteresting data, there's still probably people trying to hack your systems regularly. Hopefully, it turns out to be some teenager who's just trying to, put a picture of his favorite meme on your website, not cause you some serious reputational damage. So one of the last things we'll actually recognize is that there's quite a number of security organizations. So how does the information from security organizations and people who are actually providing recommendations like OWASP filter into your organization? How are people injecting that into the organization that you're part of? Where is your pipeline of that? Is it pull? Is it push? If you think about it, most news organizations, if you still focus on news, send out or have, and it's starting to become things where we're seeing this with not only news organizations, but also nonprofits and just about anybody. So instead of trying to get you to come to their website and see all sorts of things, or go to their news channel, or go to here or there, they're sending out their top 5, their top 10. So where is that email that you're getting every week with the top 5 things around security that are important for your organization? What is it that you're seeing as evolution? We're bringing in this new tool. Here's how you learn it. Here's the expert. Here's this brown bag the expert is doing. Here's something that happened at one of our competitors that we don't want to happen here. All of these things in terms of giving people 5 simple sentences that allow them to click through and start to participate. Because getting people to participate in a world where almost all of us wear multiple hats. So congratulations. For anybody who joined the session today, if you weren't already part of this community, welcome to the DevSecOps community, which is a subset or a superset, depending on how you look at it, of the overall DevOps community. So welcome, and recognize there's a lot to learn. So for OWASP, they have their top 10, and we'll actually talk through a number of these. About every 3 years they release these, and the release that they did at the end of last year was actually almost comical, because so many people wanted to who participate in this wanted to put their stamp on it and wanted to actually recognize that in terms of things like InfoSec or DevSecOps, there is a significant amount of evolution that's happening, and that change is leaving a lot of people in the dust if they're not aware of what those changes are or have some way through the organization to get that input. So just a list, feel free to jump out to the OWASP top 10 in terms of that, because no surprise, good reading, and that'll take you a few days right there. So insufficient logging and monitoring. So I'll boil this slide down to basically one thing. How many actual standards do you have for logging and monitoring? And if I look at an organization that has 1,000 applications, has been around for 50, 60, 100 years, has been doing application development since the COBOL days, or maybe earlier than that even, I would guess that I could find within a short period of time, if I was given CIO, Office of the CIO access to your organization, 10 different standards. Those 10 different standards are going to reflect writing things in different places and doing all sorts of different ways, and monitoring and trailing and auditing. And all of this comes down to one key thing. If you don't all speak the same language from logging and monitoring, then most likely you're leaving a lot of holes in the organization. And is this something that just automatically changes overnight? Well, heck no. So the whole point of this is that this is a long-term roadmap. To get to a really fully DevOps organization, a really fully cloud application organization, a really fully information security DevSecOps is a constant evolution. And it's not a 3-week or 3-month, or in some cases, and in most cases, even a 3-year journey. It's years of undoing the technical debt and recognizing that by connecting all of our systems to the internet, indirectly or directly, we're basically opening up holes that we never expected and people didn't even know about 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or in some cases yesterday. So injection. So people have been focused on injection attacks forever, but if you think about it, it's funny because injection continues to be a problem, because as we move into new things like time series databases like InfluxDB written in the Go programming language, the notion of actually pulling in our Active Directory, if we're using Microsoft's Active Directory, which most, if not a majority of organizations are across the world, tied back into the authentication schemes of our cloud providers or some other type of OAuth or other authentication authorization. Where is it that we actually are seeing these injection attacks? And source code review, you know, we want to automate it as much as possible, but the real problem here is that the people doing the review have to be security experts themselves, and most people aren't. That's the reason why many organizations are moving from SOAP services to REST, because expecting developers to be security programmers at the same time in a world which is rapidly evolving and where many of the most experienced developers are retiring in this next wave across at least North America and a large portion of Europe, we have to actually start to wrap our applications with security that allows us to audit trail and recognize penetration and actually keep things secure so that we can have focused efforts rather than trying to make every single person a triangle in security programming or security administration or secure data modeling, secure database creation, secure, you name it. So, and of course we want to be using our static and dynamic testing tools, this notion of SAST and DAST. So if you've never heard those acronyms, welcome to the DevSecOps community. SAST and DAST are key areas. Pen testing, all of these things, key areas of an organization. And at the very least, getting yourself into a micro learning or one of our WebAge classes around DevSecOps is a key in terms of being able to speak the right language. There's a whole lot of terms and vocabulary that we're not going to cover in 1 hour, and that would actually be difficult to cover in 1 day. But you want to be always thinking continuous learning. And what is the impact, or what's in it for me? Well, what's in it for me is at least I can be, informed. And when I see something, I'll be able to say something and be part of the you are it for my organization around security. So broken authentication. So here, this confirmation of user's identity, this using stock usernames from third-party packages, this notion of not doing multi-factor authentication. NIST, who developed the cloud standard, more than probably 10 years ago now, has, clearly in one of their recent standards said password rotation is a really bad idea. Not because password rotation itself is bad, it's because by regularly forcing people to rotate passwords, they come up with ways to game the password change. The idea that I could append a 0102 on the end of a password, it wasn't just one person who came up with that. If you look at a history of passwords and you have an audit trail that allows you to actually see what people are doing, and so an anonymized function. So if you think about this, people are allowed to set passwords. That's great. Why is it that we don't have a way in your organization, and we're seeing this changing, to anonymize that or just remove the whole username password thing altogether? Some of the things that we're seeing coming from military grade authentication and authorization. And so think about it. What is it that you know? And then mirror to say, what is it that I really don't know around how this is evolving? And so sensitive data exposure. So no surprise when people started moving into cloud, what they didn't realize is that data wasn't encrypted at rest in most of the cloud providers. It is in many cases now, but it's always a question of, what is it that are your standards, to ask questions of your vendors. And if you're using a software as a service, it's brought in by the business, brought in by somebody through shadow IT, brought in by yourself in terms of an information technology or a business partner usage. What is it that your questions are that you've asked so that you can actually get that into production? This whole notion of production readiness involves a security audit, and that should be something that's thought of up front. Security in a run book as people are developing the application, so you recognize this, and so the developers are actually part of that, and the designers, the architects, up front, and getting everybody involved in the discussion of what security looks like in an ever-evolving culture. Bringing in third parties, bringing in somebody like the DevSecOps coaches at WebAge, if you're not experts yourself, so that you can take some time, do some learning, and then Lord knows, walk us out the door so you can do it on your own when you're ready. So one of the last things we'll throw out here is really, again, a little bit of humor. So I like to start with something hopefully funny. And if you don't think this is funny, well, I'm sorry, this is the best I'm going to do. So the idea is start out with something funny and end with something funny. And so if you think about it, here's, one from Randy Glassbergen that I really like, and somebody who I regularly see and recommend for injecting security-related cartoons, because we have all these motivational posters all over in many organizations. Hopefully we have the core values and the mission clearly available to people, but we have to make it clear, what is the security? Do people in your organization realize that on average, 12% of people click on an email or an attachment that's a phishing attack. 12%. That's more than 1 in 10 people will actually open or click on something that's going to cause the organization some kind of loss. It could be an individual impact, and it could be just breaking something they have. What is it when you start talking about bring your own device? What is that usual stuff? I'm assuming that most people are not being attacked by the Joker, Penguin, Catwoman, or the Riddler, but who are those most likely attack vectors being driven by in your organization? What is that prioritized set of data? How do you actually recognize that this data, this application really is the crown jewels of the organization? As one of my favorite organizations I work with in enterprise refers to their key applications. So what are your crown jewels? What are your main data streams? What are the things that if they were lost or compromised would create enough damage to make it a recognition that there needed to be significant change? And then how can you bring that up in a gentle yet rigorous and accelerated way to make sure that something gets done? So that was actually all I had. I don't think I've seen any questions yet, but I'll just double check. So I appreciate you joining in today. We have about 8 minutes. If you have questions, that's great. If not, we'll make sure for everybody who got signed in that we send you out the deck. And again, feel free to connect on LinkedIn. And otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful fall season. Or if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, a wonderful spring season. And so thank you for coming. Thank you for participating. And thank you for being part of the DevSecOps community. This is George Neese signing off. I appreciate your time today, and I hope that you found it to be well worth the investment of time that you put into it. Bye now. Cheers.